Africa is home to approximately 700 million people. They live in more than 50 countries and are divided into hundreds of ethnic groups with different languages, religions, and customs. Their continent has a rich and fascinating history. Many people believe that Africa was the homeland of the first humans that ever lived on Earth. Simple stone tools and fossilized bones from African archaeological sites date back more than 1 million years. Much later images, painted or engraved on stones, give us an idea of what life was like when early humans lived by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. Then, about 8,000 years ago in Egypt's Nile Valley, people began to control their environment by planting crops and raising animals. They irrigated their fields with water from the Nile River and lived in villages not too different from those still found there today. Egyptian civilization developed here about 5,000 years ago. The people were ruled by kings who were called pharaohs. Early pharaohs built these pyramids at Giza to be their tombs. Later pharaohs built great temples to honor their gods. Around 1000 BC, techniques of growing crops and herding animals spread to fertile lands south of the Sahara Desert. In the first few centuries AD, when most of North Africa was part of the Roman Empire, camels came into widespread use for traveling and carrying goods. These hardy animals made it possible for merchants to travel together in caravans and cross the Sahara Desert to trade with other regions. In the 7th century AD, Arab armies swept across North Africa, spreading the religion of Islam and the Arabic language. Followers of Islam are called Muslims, and within a few centuries, most North Africans had become Muslims. Muslim traders and missionaries spread their religion southward, along trade routes across the Sahara Desert. Muslim mosques, used for religious worship, were built in West African trading centers such as Jenny and Timbuktu. The remains of a stone-walled fortress in Mali remind us that great chieftains ruled large kingdoms and empires in parts of West Africa during medieval times. Large towns also grew up around mosques along Africa's east coast. The prosperity that built these settlements was based on trade with Arabs from Southwest Asia. Other settlements, such as Great Zimbabwe, developed in the southern part of the continent. Their economies were based primarily on raising cattle. During the 15th century, Portuguese navigators began to explore Africa's Atlantic coast in their search for a sea route to Asia. The Cape of Good Hope, just west of Africa's southern tip, was rounded in 1497 by a Portuguese fleet, captained by Vasco da Gama. Da Gama reached India the next year, and from that time on, contact increased between European countries and the coastal margins of Sub-Saharan Africa. In 1652, a Dutch outpost was set up in the shadow of Table Mountain, near Africa's southern tip. This settlement at Cape Town attracted Dutch and French colonists, whose descendants built these distinctive Cape Dutch homes. Over the years, Cape Town grew and is now one of Africa's largest cities. Most early European settlements in Africa, however, were small fortified trading posts along the coast or on offshore islands. Trade goods, including slaves to be shipped to the Americas, were brought to outposts such as Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal. Many of the slaves had been captured in raids led by North African slavers, or were captives taken in intertribal wars. These unfortunate victims were marched to the coast, then sold to European and American ship captains, who transported them to the Americas. On Gorée, you can still see houses where the slaves were kept in dark quarters. The merchants, who were often of mixed African and European descent, lived comfortably on the upper floors. For almost all of the slaves, the dreadful passage across the Atlantic was a journey of no return. In In the 19th century, anti-slavery movements in Europe slowly brought an end to the transatlantic slave trade. During the same period, Christian missionaries moved into the African interior, hoping to make converts. The writings of early missionaries such as David Livingstone made the rest of the world aware of Africa's great mineral wealth and agricultural resources. European countries competed with each other for control of the continent, and by the early 20th century, nearly all of Africa had been divided between them. The period of colonial rule ended during the second half of the century, as independence movements led to the creation of today's African countries. Since these countries are based on boundaries established by the European powers, they often contain ethnically diverse populations. This has made it a challenge to build a sense of nationality among a country's citizens and has sometimes led to armed conflict. In addition, several of the countries are landlocked, meaning that they have no direct access to the sea. This makes trade with the rest of the world more difficult and places their products at a disadvantage in world markets. Today, all the countries in Africa have gained their independence from foreign rule. However, many retain important economic and cultural ties to the colonial powers that once governed them. For example, in countries that were once part of French West Africa, the French language is still widely read and spoken. French, therefore, serves as a common language, or lingua franca. The term lingua franca is used for any language that allows people who speak different languages to communicate with each other. English is used as a lingua franca in regions that were once British colonies. The Swahili language was developed along the East African coast as a common language for traders. Today, it is widely spoken in East Africa and is the official language of Tanzania and Kenya. The people of Africa are very different from each other in appearance and culture. North Africans who live near the Mediterranean Sea have many traits in common with the people who live on the eastern shores of the same sea. Most North Africans are Caucasians, speak Arabic, and are Muslims who follow the teachings of Islam. South of the Sahara, the majority of Africans are blacks. Many speak one of the numerous Bantu languages. In Sub-Saharan Africa, most people identify with one of hundreds of different ethnic groups. Each group values its distinctive heritage. For example, variations in dance styles illustrate different traditions that have developed over the centuries. South Africa's Zulu people often perform dances that celebrate their success as great warriors. In contrast, the dances of the Dogon people in Mali are performed so that the ancestors will be pleased and will help people bring in a good harvest. The people of an ethnic group often follow occupations that are traditional for their group. For example, in Mali, the Fula people are cattle herders. The Bozos and the Bambara people are fishermen and boatmen on the Niger River. The Dogon people are farmers. Their villages lie in the shelter of a steep cliff where their ancestors sought protection from their enemies. The San, or Bushmen, of southern Africa are smaller and lighter skinned than most sub-Saharan Africans. The Cape Coloreds are another distinctive southern African group. They are descendants of European settlers and the native Hottentots of the Cape Town region. As we mentioned earlier, Islam is the predominant religion in North Africa. As you can see from numerous urban and village mosques in such countries as Senegal and Mali, Islam is also the main religion of the Sahel region, just south of the Sahara Desert. Further south, churches are more common than mosques, because there are many Christians in Central and Southern Africa. However, throughout much of Sub-Saharan Africa, traditional beliefs coexist with both Christianity and Islam. Many people with traditional beliefs feel that the spirits of their ancestors play an important role in their daily lives. This ancestor worship is one part of an ancient tradition of animism, a way of believing that attributes conscious life to inanimate objects and to things in nature. Animists may honor the spirits of the waters, the trees, and the rocks. In animist villages, traditional diviners and healers help people to understand the will of the many spirits. They have a good knowledge of herbal remedies and people's psychological needs. Often they work in cooperation with medical researchers and doctors to combat the tropical diseases that are common in Africa. Africa is home to approximately 700 million people, first humans that ever lived on Earth. Simple stone tools and fossilized bones from African archaeological sites date back more than 1 million years. Much later images, painted or engraved on stones, give us an idea of what life was like when early humans lived by hunting wild animals and gathering. Civilization developed here about 5,000 years ago. The people were ruled by kings who were called pharaohs. Early pharaohs built these pyramids at Giza to be their tombs. Later pharaohs built great temples to honor their gods. Around 1000 BC, they live in more than 50 countries and are divided into hundreds of ethnic groups with different languages, religions, and customs. Their continent has a rich and fascinating history. Many people believe that Africa was the homeland of the wild plants. Then, about 8,000 years ago in Egypt's Nile Valley, people began to control their environment by planting crops and raising animals. They irrigated their fields with water from the Nile River and lived in villages not too different from those still found there today. Egyptians